Dr. Selin Karana from the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Today, I'm going to be presenting you populist leaders in contemporary global politics. You might have heard that some of the leaders, such as Donald Trump, Nicolas Maduro, or Viktor Orban, have been associated with populism. So constantly, by scholars, journalists, they have been called as or labeled as populists. But what do we mean by populism? What we should learn about it, and why we should care about populism. Today I'm going to be trying to explain this populist phenomenon in global politics. And currently it's a very hot topic, and it has been debated by various scholars and leaders, basically, because leaders are accusing each other as populists as well. So these are the questions that I'm going to be answering today for you. Is populism a new phenomenon? Just a little bit spoiler about this question. No, it's not. I'm going to explain it in detail. What's populism, by the way? I'm going to explain in detail. What are the specific conditions required for setting the stage for populism? So which conditions determine, which conditions set the stage and result in populism to appear? Who is populist leader? Which characteristics are necessary to call a leader as populist? Who are the populist leaders across regions? I'm going to basically cover these questions, and I'm going to try to answer to these questions. My first question is that, is populism a new phenomenon? As I already told you, no, it's not. It actually dates back to Roman Republic, when Gaius Julius Caesar attempted to obtain the support of the plebs, populares, in order to transform the political system of Roman Republic. And thanks to this support of plebs through giving them concessions, privileges, economic benefits, Caesar was able to transform political system. So it ended up with the demise of Roman Republic, and it's replaced with Roman Empire, because Caesar was able to entitle himself as dictator for life, and he was able to establish Roman Empire. This was the first example of populism in history. But we see this emergence of populism in 19th century as well, especially in USA and Russia. We see this social movements demanding for political inclusion and resisting to the establishment because their interests were not represented by the establishment. In USA, these were the farmers demanding their rights against bankers and their collaboration with politicians, which were saving the interests of bankers instead of farmers. And populism in the United States in those times were supporting the rights of and political inclusion of farmers. And similarly, in Russian populism, we see this demands of peasants to be included in political system again. But these are not examples of populism, because if we want to understand populism, first we should look at Latin America, because it's the region where populism originated actually. In Latin America, we see two waves of populism, the first one, which is called as classical populism, started in the 1930s, just after the Great Depression, and with the effects of Great Depression, basically. I'm going to be talking about it a little bit in detail in this for this first wave. And the second wave, which was renamed as neo-populism, emerged in the 1990s and still continues to affect both world politics and basically Latin American region. So, what's the first wave of populism? In the first wave of populism, we see this emergence of, these are the not only examples, but more clear examples of populist cases in Latin America in those times. In the first wave, we see Juan Domingo Perón and Getulio Vargas as the exemplary cases of populism. What was common to these leaders was that they were trying to incorporate working class without resorting to a Marxist, a proletarian revolution. So instead of seeking political transformation through revolution and violence, through weapons, they prefer to stay in the political system, in democratic system, and incorporate working class to this exclusory political regime, which was in essence oligarchic. So they tried to expand the electoral basis by incorporating working class, and apart from that, they were providing some material benefits to mostly excluded and deprived of economic benefits and interests the majority of that society in Latin America, especially in Brazil and Argentina, because majority of the population at that time were living under the poverty line. So they were demanding for both political inclusion and economic benefits, and those two leaders provided them these. And thanks to that, they were able to transform political system into a new system in which they were the center of the power. So both of the leaders were accused of having authoritarian tendencies, but still they remain in the democratic political system. So populism emerges within democratic systems, but it might be harmful, or otherwise we can call it as corrective force, that I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the conclusion part as well. So it might be harmful to democracy or beneficial for democracy as well. So populism has a double face. But still, we see this first wave putting stamp on the history of Latin America, and it was repeated in the second wave of populism, which is called as neo-populism as well. So, what is populism basically? What we should understand from populism, why we should care about populism. Because populism is a transformative force which rises within political system, especially democratic ones, but instead of turning the system automatically into an authoritarian regime, it might both generate positive characteristics and negative ones for the democratic system. But before going into details of defining the relationship between populism and democracy, let's try to understand what do we mean by populism. Populism has two definitions in the literature. These are the most apparent ones, accepted ones in the literature, so I picked it for you. The first one is provided by Kasmudde and Rovira Kaltwasser, who calls populism as a teen-centered ideology, which considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, general will of the people. So, according to these scholars, populism is a teen-centered ideology. So it's not like fascism or communism, but it can be juxtaposed to those ideologies. So populist politics, populist leaders, populist movements or parties can be incorporated into other ideologies as well. But what is central to populism in this definition is that two homogeneous and antagonistic camps are located within society, and the leader or parties or social movements are benefiting or taking advantage of this deep divisions within society. And by using the discourse of pure people against the corrupt elite, they are gaining some benefits or power from politics to centralize themselves, to obtain the votes or support of the electorate, basically. So, in this definition, which is called as ideational definition as well, we see this idea of the society separated into two camps. This is the second definition of populism, which is a little bit different, and is provided by Kurt Weiland, who defines populism as a political strategy consisted of three main characteristics, which are a personal leader who appeals to a heterogeneous mass of followers feeling excluded and available for mobilization, a direct and quasi-personal relationship between the leader and his/her constituency, which bypasses established intermediary organizations, especially parties. This definition is valid for Latin American leaders, basically. Why this is the case? Because economically lesser developed regions of the world is open for the rise of leaders who can personalize the power through polarizing the society, through taking advantage of deep cleavages in that society. Therefore, Kurt Weiland emphasizes the role of the leader in this definition, but personally I support the idea that we should combine these two definitions of populism in order to understand the populism. Because when we look at global politics, we would see that in global politics, leaders are center of attention right now. So they are transforming their countries. Let me go back to my leaders to show you again. So these are the leaders which are at the center of the politics. They are the generator of their political system. They are transforming it through constitutional changes or through bypassing the legislative or intimidating judiciary. They are taking the control of politics. So populism should be more than a teen-centered ideology. It should be an ideology combined with political strategy of the leaders to centralize their authority on the rule of the country, basically. So, I understand populism on the basis of leadership styles, combining a discourse by using the discourse of two separate camps of a society, and the leader as the embodiment of national will, the supporter of one side towards the other side. So the leader claims that he or she is the embodiment of national will, supporting, representing the interest of pure people against the others. So I'm going to go in detail a little bit later on in this characteristics of a populist leader. But before going to that, I want to explain conditions resulting in populism. So which conditions open the way of populism? So these are the conditions which we should be finding in countries or regions for populism to appear. Economic crisis creates some losers in that specific country. So some people are hurt by the economic crisis, and it's actually the majority of the society whose interests are lost in this economic crisis situations. When political parties cannot come up with solutions to problems created by economic crisis, then people search for an alternative who will provide them more hope for better society and better future. So, crisis of representative democracy, loss in trust in political parties might open up for new leaders to appeal to people, to taking advantage of their resentment towards the representative democracy, basically. And when there is high level of socioeconomic inequality, the portion of the people who are living deprived of conditions deprived of economic well-being are open to or inclined to support the leaders who will provide them better opportunities, material benefits. So social and economic privileges or rights. So when there is high level of socioeconomic inequality, we would expect that leaders can appeal to majority of the population to carve up political system and to centralize his or her ruling in the country. And lastly, when there is a high level of economic inequality, we would expect deep social cleavages, deep social divisions, like oligarchic system of Latin American countries, in which the majority of people hasn't the privileges that small number of oligarchic people had. So when there is antagonism between two groups of people within a society, either by economic or culturally, because you know, in Europe, due to rapid mobilization of people and high level of immigrations and immigrants, cultural antagonism that immigrants cannot adapt our cultural values, they think, the people of Europe cannot accept these immigrants. Therefore, there is this cultural clash in Europe right now, and radical populist parties are appealing to that. So, when there is economic or cultural antagonism, populists, either social movements or leaders or parties, appeal to people. So, when we have these conditions, we are ready to go to have populist leaders or parties or social movements. Actually, depend on the conditions and history. We have different histories and actors of populism in regions. In Europe, it's the parties and social movements who are labeled as populists. But in less developed regions like Latin America, we expect leaders to appear as populist actors. It's also caused by the political system of their democracies, because presidential systems are open to or more inclined to more personalization of politics. So when we say populist leaders, if you look at Latin America or United States of America, it's more likely to have these leaders. But this doesn't mean that in Europe there are no populist leaders, that I'm going to show you the list later on. So, who is populist leader? Which characteristics populist leaders have? First, they should be able to directly appeal to people. So, they should be a center of attention and charm. But this charm can only be achieved by having the charisma. So, I'm sorry to say this, but most of the populist leaders are men, so I'm going to continue saying his or his. This is because of the unequal nature of politics in which man dominates, so to say. So, he should be a strong man, a good orator to appeal to people. But this is not enough. There should be a sense of he is one of us. So he understands our values. He shares our values. There should be an emotional attachment to that leader. And the leader should be chameleonic character, which means that he can be acting in a way, and the following day he can change his way. So he can say, no, it wasn't the case. I was acting on the conditions of that specific day. Okay, and ideologically, because attaching to hard ideologies like communism, fascism, the leader can change his direction easily, because populism can be perceived as a teen-centered ideology which can be attached to other hardcore ideologies. And one of the most important characteristics of populist leaders is that he should claim that he is the embodiment of the national will. So he represents the true demands, interests of the poor people. But by claiming that he is the national will, representing the national will, he both attacks establishment parties by accusing them as traitors, or by saying that he is representing the true demands of the people. He attracts attention of the people, he obtains the support of the people, and eventually he transforms the political system through such an extent that he becomes the center of all power. So in this part we might say that populism can be dangerous, and it might add up some anti-democratic features to political system. But I'm going to delve into this later on. Let's have a look at who are these populist leaders. What are the exemplary cases of populist leaders across regions? In regional context, we would see that due to anti-immigration policies, populism in Europe often refers to anti-immigration and xenophobia. So leaders, parties, or social movements in Europe, populist ones, are dealing with this issue of anti-immigration, saving or protecting their pure people against the newcomers, or emotional attachment to conservative values, or having the right-wing tendencies, etc. But in Latin America, it frequently alludes to clientelism and economic mismanagement. Why this is the case? Because in Latin America, due to presidential system, presidents are popular figures, and through use of nationalism and economic developmentalism strategy to transform the economics of the country, they often resort to redistributive politics and economics. So they follow economic policies in which the majority of the people living under poverty lines benefit from. Therefore, but in return for their support for the leader, of course. Therefore, it's linked to clientelism and economic mismanagement, because instead of keeping their expenses on the margin, they go overuse their state resources to obtain more support for their presidency. Therefore, clientelism and economic mismanagement are the defining characteristics of Latin American populism. So, let's have a look at names. Who are we talking about? Populist leaders in Latin America can be exemplified by Hugo Chavez, because he almost initiated a new sub-wave within the second wave, which is called as neoliberalism. And after he passed away in 2013, he was succeeded by Nicolas Maduro. He's, again, a very famous, very important political figure from Venezuela. And in Bolivia, Evo Morales, he is the first indigenous president of the country, and due to violence and pressures and clashes, he fled Bolivia and went to Mexico. So Bolivia is a little bit in hot mess after a populist leader, but he was a good example of a populist leader, actually. North America, of course, Donald Trump is a good example of a populist leader who is a polarizing figure, who has charisma, who influences people, who talks about the true patriots or true people of United States. He follows anti-immigration policies, so he accused immigrants from Latin America for unemployment rates, etc. So he's another good example of populist leaders. And if you look at populist leaders in Europe, we would see that we have many. But basically, we see this domination of right-wing parties in Europe. For instance, Matteo Salvini from Northern League, Lega Nord, is a very good example of how populist radical right parties in Europe are opposing immigrants, how they speak about the true people of Europe and their countries who deserve better lives, instead of giving concessions or privileges to newcomers, the immigrants. Especially, they underline the values of Christianity, so they have a religious basis as well. And this is the case for almost all populist radical right parties. So Fidesz, Hungarian Civic Alliance in Hungary, Viktor Orban, he's at the right corner of my presentation with blue eyes. He's now, his policies are hot debate right now. So he's abusing his authority, presidential powers in these extraordinary conditions of pandemic. So he is trying to increase his domination in Hungarian politics right now. Therefore, he has been criticized very intensively. And National Front or Front National in France, Jean-Marie Le Pen was the father, but he passed away. Therefore, his daughter right now, Marine Le Pen, is leading the party. Again, the same policies are valid for this party as well. Pim Fortuyn lists in the Netherlands. Pim Fortuyn was assassinated, but it's an interesting exemplary case of populism because he established his party to run the elections. Kurt Weyland's definition can be valid for European politics as well. Therefore, I was claiming that we should combine those two definitions. And lastly, law and justice in Poland. Kaczynski, again, very debatable political figure right now. So these are the populist radical right parties, but we have populist left parties who took part in governments or became a coalition partner, etc. Syriza in Greece, Alexis Tsipras, and Podemos in Spain, Pablo Iglesias Turion, are the example cases of populist left parties. Again, these parties talked about the political and economic interest of pure people against oligarchs, against the neoliberal order. They were criticizing neoliberal order, which created unequal situations, conditions for the true people of their specific country. So, I want to conclude with populist leaders and their effects on democratic system and their relationship with democracy, basically. Populist leaders claiming to be embodiment of national will. So they are claiming that they are the true representatives of the people. So they provide some social, economic, and political benefits to the people. And these benefits can be seen from ordinary life. They are touching ordinary lives of the people. So there's this direct relationship between the voters and the leader. Through use of referenda and surveys, the leaders establish direct links with the people. And thanks to media appearances, very oftenly, they can give the sense of, I understand you, I am one of you, I share your values, so trust in me and vote for me. They convey this message all the time. So people have trust in their presidents, their leaders, their populist leaders. But what's the problem then? The problem is that the president is just one person. And if he surpasses the power of other parties, if he sets aside other political views, or if he or she intimidates the legislative or judiciary, then distorting the checks and balances, then we can't talk about a democratic system. So, populist leaders, in this sense, can be a threat for democracy. But because they understand, they care about their people, then they can be corrective force, because representative democratic system failed to fulfill the demands of the electors. Therefore, across regions in North America or in Europe, we see this decline in political participation. So, why this is the case? Because people are disappointed in representative system. But if the populist leaders are delivering their promises, they can trust in their leaders. And their demands are fulfilled by the leaders. So, populist leaders show us that there should be a corrective force in which take the demands of the people seriously and transmit them into political system. Therefore, populism can be corrective force for representative democracy. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.